Blessings and peace, June 10th, and this is Unexpected Virtue, Anger. And I bring to you texts that make me angry. So Phyllis Tribble wrote a book called Texts of Terror that was basically obligatory, mandatory reading for me when I was in seminary. And Phyllis Tribble wrote about those texts that when you read them, you can't help but go, what? This is in Scripture? What? Texts like Hagar, which we're about to preach on pretty soon here, and Tamar, who is the victim of sexual violence at the hands of her brother, and the unnamed woman in the book of Judges, who is gang raped and murdered and then dismembered. And this, by the way, is the event that leads to the capture and the rape of 600 more women. And the list just goes on, right? But you read these and you can't help but be angry. So why am I talking about this? Well, because it's Anger Week. And it's not just about how people in Scripture deal with anger, but sometimes we read texts in Scripture and they make us angry. And that's real too. What are we supposed to do with these Scriptures? What do we do with these texts? Sometimes it's enough to know that they're just there. Because when something that's that glaringly ugly and obvious stares you in the face, it's enough. It's enough. Because it points to something that is so wrong, so unjust, so morally bankrupt, so awful, that it's clear it's not saying, go thou and do likewise. It's saying, oh, fix this. And when you have a text like that, it can stand beautifully alongside some of the horrible terror stories that are making the news today. And when these stories go side by side, you just look at them and say, yep, it makes me angry. Because the injustice is so obvious. The horror is so glaring that we got to fix this. It's not right. And that's what the beauty of these Scriptures is for me. I read them and hold them in all of their context, and they go side by side. We hear these stories and we read them, and to interpret systems of abuse and power, and systems of abuse and power. And where do we find God in the mix of this? From one generation to the next, knowing that what was happening here sure seems to be happening here. Well, we find God in the people who are fighting those systems of injustice, pointing to what is glaringly wrong, working toward trying to make it right. We find God in those who have the eyes to see. What we see in these stories is that we have the eyes to see. And each generation will have our texts of terror. And we will have to wrestle with them. And we will have to be angry. In reading Phyllis Tribble, in reading Scripture, looking at these texts, no one here is sanctioning social or political or economic abuse and death. All we can do is have them stand and hold the corruption before us. And they stand as indictments, all on their own. We get to work toward changing so that no more Hagars and Tamars and unnamed women, no more George Floyds, no more of those whose names we must repeat and say again and again in our generation. We get to say, this is terror. This makes me angry. And I am called in my generation to follow a God of justice and righteousness, mercy, hope and love and grace. This is what I'm called to do. And these things are so appalling that they just stand on their own as horrific. And I'm called here to work to expose that ugly. Amen.